This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben.
Welcome back, Alethia! We have greatly missed you these last few months since you've been off on parental leave, and you came back at just the right time, or maybe just the wrong time, because budget season has arrived. And this is Governor Gretchen Whitmer's administration's penultimate budget proposal. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty of her presentation when we speak with Bridge, Michigan's Jonathan Oosting later in the podcast. But for now, Alethia, this is the governor's spending plan, but they don't always personally present it, right?
Well, first, I am so happy to be back, Cheyna, and we are really jumping right in here as we kick off the budget season. And like you said, Budget Director Jen Flood presented the administration's spending plan to lawmakers this week, which is fairly common. Governors don't always go to this. They sort of leave it to their experts. That's why they chose them to be budget directors. However, this did mark the first time since 2002 where the governor did not take any questions from the press about the budget on the day of the presentation. Usually there's some sort of press conference later, roundtable, whatever, with press, where the governor will get into some of her ideas. She didn't do that this year, but it is a long budget season, so we've got some time. And unlike other years, the state of the state has not happened yet. And the governor is set to make another announcement next week, which we will talk about a little later.
Yeah, it is definitely going to be a long budget season, at least into the summer when they're supposed to have it done. And while Whitmer, a Democrat, still holds signing power and the Senate is still controlled by Democrats, the House is now under GOP control. Republicans have been critical of budgets under Democratic control, and the House Speaker has already signaled this process could go through the end of the fiscal year at the end of September, rather than wrapping up in June or July like it's kind of supposed to.
Yeah, we've got some time in front of us to really dig into this budget and to see what lawmakers want to do. As for the governor's spending plan, this is not a huge change from recent years. The governor wants to boost funding for financial aid covering community colleges and public university students, continue funding preschool for 4-year-olds, free breakfast and lunch at schools, increase per pupil funding at public schools. There's also some new initiatives for K through 12 schools to attempt to improve student achievement. We've had, some poor test scores come out. The governor is looking at new incentives for best practices, encouraging communication with parents, things that they say will really dig into data and use that to, help schools maybe right a ship here.
I mean, that's a lot, and that barely scratches the surface of just the education part of this budget proposal. The proposal also calls for a tax on e-cigarettes and nicotine patches. It brings back proposals to increase the fees for out-of-state waste and make the Passport Recreation Program, which provides access to state parks, and opt-out rather than the current opt-in. There's also a call to increase some hunting and other fees as well, and all of these likely face an uphill climb given the GOP control of the House.
And, this budget is also big for what isn't in it. The governor is planning to reveal a long-term road funding plan sometime next week. So in the budget, there isn't much new as it pertains to roads for now, but this is the Fix the Damn Roads governor. And she says she's going to have a plan to present next week, and we'll just have to see what that is.
Another thing to watch in the coming months is how federal funding to the state may change. Will there be less funding than usual to certain areas? Will funding be allocated differently and potentially be used in new ways? President Donald Trump's administration caused some confusion with federal aid recently, but he has pulled back. But more changes could come.
Again, I feel like the theme of our conversation today is it is a long road ahead. There are some uncertainties in this year's budget, a little bit related to actual funding, how much money we have, but mostly it's just questions about the process. How long will it take? How will lawmakers work together in this new legislature to pass a final spending plan before October?
We're going to take a short break here, but when we come back, we're going to be joined by Bridge, Michigan Deputy Editor Jonathan Oosting to get into all the details of Governor Gretchen Whitmer's budget proposal. You're not going to want to miss it. Welcome back to MichMash. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben. We're joined now by Bridge, Michigan Deputy Editor Jonathan Oosting. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let's start at the top. Governor Whitmer is proposing an $83.5 billion with a B dollar budget. What are the big ticket items in it?
Well, I mean, big ticket is a relative term, right? Obviously, the top line number, $83.5 billion, is a very big number. It's, I would say kind of a status quo budget compared to last year. It's about $1 billion more than the version she proposed at the same time last year. But, the big ticket items are things that the governor has prioritized in years past in general. Obviously, new money for education, about a 4% increase for the operating side of both K-12 schools and colleges. She is... we found very interesting proposing some new taxes, some of which she's tried before and some of which she has not. So she's bringing back a landfill tipping fee proposal that is probably dead on arrival in the legislature now that Republicans control the House. But also, interestingly, a new one, she's proposing a vape tax, essentially extending the current tax on tobacco products like cigars or chewing tobacco to e-cigarettes, vapes, but also pouches. Like apparently these Zyn pouches are very popular with some younger folks, hopefully not minors these days. And the governor wants to tax those too. In both cases, the money would be used for either environmental cleanup or for prevention efforts to prevent youth from using vapes or to prevent cancer. Those things stood out to me. But in general, the governor is kind of proposing a lot of the similar things that she has in years past.
Jonathan, what were the initial reaction to, the vape tax and these fees, right? I mean, the governor, looking at the tipping fee, the recreation passport, making that an opt-out rather than an opt-in, which isn't really a fee increase, but the idea is that more people would end up buying it if you have to opt out instead of opt in. What was the initial reaction? If we couldn't get this done with a Democratic legislature, what's the governor looking at with the Republican House?
Yeah, I mean, the general reaction from Republicans was they don't hate the budget. There are some ideas that they thought they could support, but they don't want to spend more money than last year, essentially. So that, without saying it directly, in a lot of cases, is going to rule out new revenue, such as these taxes. I know the House Appropriations Chair Boland said in general she is concerned about youth vaping and so on, but isn't sure a tax is something she would support. And of course, a lot of lawmakers on the Republican side, and they now control the state House, they've signed pledges not to raise taxes at all. So I think, that she couldn't, as you mentioned, couldn't get like the landfill tipping fee or the parks recreation passport proposals through a Democratic-led legislature last year. I can't imagine she's going to get it through a Republican-led state House this year.
I want to focus a little bit on the education budget, which is a huge part of all this. Last year, Governor Whitmer got a lot of pushback for freezing the per pupil grant levels at the previous year's amount. How do you think educators are going to like this year's proposals?
I think so far the response has been fairly positive. She is not only proposing an increase in the per pupil funding allowance, which education groups wanted last year, but she's also addressing what was a real sticking point last year, which is in mental health and school safety funding. If you recall, it's kind of in the weeds a little bit, but the governor had put a lot of one-time funding into the budget for those efforts 2 years ago. Last year took that money out because it had been one time. Republicans and school groups called it a massive cut. The state ended up reversing that in part, but now the governor is going back to sort of her proposal from 2 years ago, or funding level from 2 years ago, to give schools more direct funding for mental health and school safety initiatives, which of course have been a really big deal, not only on the school safety front because of Oxford and other, real emergencies in schools, but also mental health side, the recovery from the COVID COVID-19 pandemic is still very much a real thing, and there's still a lot of calls from the education community for those mental health supports.
So, this budget, if passed as proposed, would leave little money on the balance sheet, little money left over in both the general fund and the school aid fund. I think combined, it would be less than $20 million. When we talk about, Republicans not wanting to spend more, Republicans being concerned about, funding overall, is that going to cause some heartburn?
Yeah, I mean, in general, right, lawmakers in the end usually end up spending most of the money that the state has, right? You can argue over the details, but, in general, the governor is proposing some more debt pay down and a rainy day fund allocation as well. So the state is building up its reserves in case of an emergency that something happens. But certainly, spending almost everything the state has when it again is poised to make a little more money than last year and more than originally anticipated, has, renewed calls. Eric Nesbitt, the Senate Minority Leader, is renewing his calls for more of a broad tax cut or some other way to give money back to voters instead of simply spending everything that the state is getting via tax money, but also, of course, federal revenues as well, which are a big part of this budget.
Now, the Democrats are going to be negotiating this budget without that trifecta that they enjoyed for a couple of years. How smooth do you think this process is going to be? We've already alluded to the speaker saying that it might go into September.
Yeah, I mean, there's already open conversation about a government shutdown. So that's
exactly where you want to be.
Yeah, never a great sign. But I think it remains to be seen. I mean, there's some real interesting dynamics playing out in the legislature right now and the relationship with Governor Whitmer in particular. Speaker Matt Hall has also been going out of his way to praise Governor Whitmer and her approach to trying to work across the aisle, not only in the legislature, but the way she's kind of held fire on President Donald Trump in a lot of respects compared to some other Democratic governors. So clearly Whitmer is trying to, not tip the apple cart here and ruin any relationship with Republicans. And so far, Matt Hall, the House Speaker, seems pleased by that development. So, there's at least a willingness to talk and negotiate right now. Matt Hall, of course, played hardball late last year. He had his whole caucus walk out of the legislature for essentially the last week and a half or two, demanding action on paid leave and minimum wage legislation that they were pushing. So he's shown a propensity to, play the tough man when he needs to, the tough guy when he needs to. But at least in the early stages here, he's saying that he's got a good relationship going with the governor right now.
Right. And what I'm watching for, what I think will be interesting is, there's three legs to this stool, right? Like we have the governor and the Senate. They're both Democrats. The House is only one leg of this stool. What is the speaker going to do? What are the Republican lawmakers there? How are they going into this? Do they just want to slow things down and not get anything done? Or do they want to work with the Democrats and, really get a budget that they like? And that's what, we'll have to wait and see about, because like you said, the speaker, they walked out at the end of the year last year. Are they going to go in with that same attitude into this new term?
Totally. They can. I mean, Republicans have a leverage like they have not had in the last 2 years. And the budget is really where they derive a lot of that leverage right now. The Constitution requires a balanced budget by the end of the fiscal year, the start of the new fiscal year. And so, if they decide to play hardball to get something that they want, the governor may have no choice but to at least give it a real consideration.
So one item where there does appear to be some agreement, is changing the process around, what the budget and calls enhancement grants, but what we might call pet projects. This is funding to usually a specific group for some sort of project a lawmaker might want in their district. The governor has called for a new process there as part of this budget. The House has passed, some rules there too, requiring some more transparency there. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you make of it?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, House Republicans were out first with their proposal and actually adopted rules that would require. So, a lot of the consternation with a lot of these earmarks or pork or whatever you want to call it is that they're often added in the budget at the last minute. There's no real opportunity for public debate. The projects aren't publicly vetted. A lot of times, there are no bid contracts, sometimes to for-profit companies. So the House proposal would require more disclosure up front. Publicly, lawmakers would have to sponsor these earmarks beforehand, before votes, so that folks would know what's going to be voted upon. There's also some other interesting rules about, a nonprofit has to exist for more than a year before it can get one of these grants. So you wouldn't have the situation, which we've seen a couple times, where suddenly a nonprofit pops up out of nowhere and qualifies for a grant that nobody knew was coming and raises a lot of eyebrows. So the House Republicans took the lead on it. They did adopt it, and Democrats in the House unanimously approved these new rules. The governor's proposal is, it would apply to both chambers. The thing about the House proposal right now is that the Senate, Democratic-led Senate, has not adopted those rules. The governor's proposal would ostensibly apply to both chambers, and she's effectively proposing what is the current federal system, where, again, lawmakers would have to publicly disclose at least 5 days in advance of any votes. If they're sponsoring these earmarks, justify them in some sort of a statement explaining what public good they would have. And in the case of the governor's proposal, it would have to actually be approved in appropriations subcommittees, which is it's a little in the weeds, but is a notable distinction because it means there would be an opportunity to publicly debate these things before simply they're added to the budget at the 11th hour. So interesting that, we'll see where they land ultimately. But Speaker Hall, again, was pretty complimentary of the governor, although he took the opportunity to say she was following his lead. But in general, he was happy to see that the governor is proposing something similar, at least, to what House Republicans were already trying to do.
Jonathan, we've said a couple times that this is a long game here. The budget process takes a while. Throughout the next however many months, what are some of the key things that you're going to be keeping an eye on and that you encourage listeners to keep an eye on?
Yeah, well, I think, something to keep an eye on is other policy proposals that might move in the meantime. House Republicans, like I said, walked out last year over these pending minimum wage and sick leave laws that are set to take effect in just a couple weeks now. I anticipate they will try and use the budget as leverage to get some sort of agreement with the governor's office or Senate Democrats on that separate policy proposal, for instance. So there could be horse trading. You pass this thing and maybe we won't fight you as hard on this budget later down the line. Now, maybe that doesn't come to a head until, we approach the constitutional deadline for actually getting a budget done. But I'll certainly be watching in the next few months how that shakes out. Besides that, you're going to see in the House, I'm sure Republicans are going to propose a pretty different budget, and those are going to work their way through the subcommittees. And we'll see in the Senate whether Democrats even are going to embrace all of the governor's ideas. Again, it was a Democratic-led legislature last year that didn't put the tipping fee or the parks recreation fee opt-out system into the final budget that they negotiated with the governor. So will they even include it in their initial drafts? It is going to be a very long process, and it's going to test these new relationships that Speaker Hall is so far boasting about.
Jonathan Oosting, Deputy Editor for Bridge, Michigan, thank you so much for joining us on MichMash.
Yeah, thanks a lot.